Captain Dale Mercer had been flying broken ships for 11 years, and the Iron Horse was the most broken of all of them. The cargo hauler groaned when it turned, leaked warm air from a crack near the left engine, and had a navigation screen that flickered every time someone walked past it too fast. Dale had patched her up so many times that he was not sure anymore which parts were original and which were just held together by his own stubbornness that he was sitting in the pilot's seat, staring at a fuel readout that made him feel a little sick, when the ping came through. A distress beacon. Old signal, weak and stuttering, coming from a derelict vessel drifting about 40,000 kilometers off the main shipping lane near the asteroid belt of Kepler 9. Dale leaned forward and studied the data for a long moment. The ship had been dead for a while. No life signs on the scanner. No active systems. Just a beacon looping on its own, the way they did when nobody had turned them off. That he called back to the engine room. His engineer, Lena Ford, answered on the second ring. He told her about the beacon. She asked if the ship had anything worth taking. He said he did not know yet, but that they were not exactly in a position to be picky. She agreed without arguing, which told him she had also been staring at the fuel numbers. Greg Pace, his co-pilot, was already awake and eating something that smelled like canned soup when Dale walked through the small corridor to the main deck. Greg was tall and thin with a habit of talking too fast when he was nervous. He pulled up the beacon data on his own screen and said it looked like a mid-range hauler, maybe 30 years old, probably registered out of one of the outer colonies. Dale nodded and told him to start the docking approach. Their medic, Roy Atkins, came out of his bunk rubbing his eyes. Roy was a quiet man, former Army, the kind of person who never seemed to panic and never explained why. He heard what they were doing and simply went to get his kit without being asked. The docking took about 20 minutes. The derelict ship had no power to assist the lock, so Greg had to do it manually, which he did well despite muttering complaints the entire time. When the airlock finally opened and they stepped through into the dark vessel, the cold hit them immediately. Not just the cold of space, but the kind of deep, settled cold that comes when a place has been empty for a long time. Dale turned on his flashlight and swept it across the corridor. The walls were scratched. Some panels had been pulled open and stripped, wiring hanging loose like old vines. Whoever had been here before them had already taken the good stuff. Dale walked further in and found the bridge. Empty. The cargo hold near the front was the same. He felt the familiar dull weight of a wasted trip beginning to settle in. That he told the crew to check the back of the ship anyway. Sometimes people miss things in the rear sections. Greg went left, Lena went right, and Roy took the central corridor toward the back cargo bays. Dale was about to follow when Roy's voice came over the comm. It was quieter than usual, which from Roy was more alarming than shouting. Roy said Dale's name once and then said he needed him to come to Cargo Bay 4 right now. His voice had a strange, careful quality to it, like a man trying not to startle something. Dale moved fast through the dark corridor, flashlight cutting through the cold air, wondering what his medic had found that he was not ready for what was waiting at the end of the hull. Dale pushed open the heavy door to Cargo Bay 4 and stepped inside. Roy was standing near the far wall, very still, his flashlight pointed at the floor rather than straight ahead. That was the first thing Dale noticed. Roy was deliberately keeping the light low, not shining it directly at whatever was in the corner. Dale followed the edge of the beam and saw her. She was small. Much smaller than he had expected a dragon to be. She was curled on a nest made from shredded thermal blankets and what looked like old packing foam, and her scales were a deep slate blue color, dulled with dust and dried streaks that Dale realized after a moment were from crying. Her wings were tucked tight against her body, and her tail was wrapped around herself the way a frightened animal curls up to take up as little space as possible. She could not have been much bigger than a large dog, though her shape was nothing like any dog. She had a long neck, small curved horns that were barely more than nubs, and front claws that were clutching something tightly against her chest. The something was a broken toy. A little mechanical bird, silver, the kind that was supposed to flap its wings and sing. It had been snapped clean in half. She was holding both pieces together as if she could keep them from being broken just by not letting go. She was crying. Not the kind of noise people expected from a dragon. No roaring, no hissing, no fire. Just small, quiet, hitching sobs in the dark of an empty cargo bay. all alone on a ship that had been drifting through nothing for who knew how long. Dale stood in the doorway for a few seconds and did not move. Lena and Greg had followed him in. He heard Lena's breath catch sharply behind him. Greg said nothing at all, which was unusual enough that Dale glanced back at him. Greg was just staring, his expression doing something complicated. Dale thought about what his father had once told him when they found a stray dog on a back road in Nevada, half-starved and terrified of people. His father had said the only way to approach something that scared was slowly, with your hands open, and without making yourself seem big. His father had been talking about a dog. Dale figured the principle still applied that he crouched down. He moved to the side of the doorway so he was not blocking the exit, and he crouched until he was below her eye level, and he held his hands open at his sides with the flashlight pointed at the ground between them. He waited. The dragon child flinched when she first noticed him. She pressed herself harder into the corner and made a short, sharp sound that was not quite a growl. Her amber eyes were enormous in the dark, wet and exhausted and very, very scared. She clutched the broken toy tighter. Dale did not move. He just stayed there, low and still and quiet, until her breathing slowed a little. It took several minutes. Nobody behind him spoke. Lena had gone very quiet in the particular way she did when she was keeping herself from showing emotion. Roy had already taken a slow step to the side, moving carefully, giving the dragon more space. Eventually the dragon child looked at Dale for a long time with those amber eyes. She was reading him the way frightened creatures read people, looking for the thing that meant danger. Dale kept his hands open. He kept his face as calm as he could manage given that his heart was beating faster than he would have liked to admit. Then she made a sound that was softer than any sound he had heard her make. Not a growl. Not a sob. Something in between that meant nothing he could name, but that felt like a question. Lena spoke from behind him, her voice very quiet and very flat in the way it got when she was holding something difficult still inside herself. She said that whoever left this child here had just left her. Left her with nothing but a broken toy and a nest made from trash. Dale did not answer that. There was nothing useful to say about it yet. He just kept looking at the dragon child and let her keep looking at him. Getting the dragon child onto the iron horse was not easy, but it was the simplest part of what followed. She did not want to move at first. She sat in the corner of the cargo bay for almost an hour while Dale stayed crouched nearby and the others waited in the corridor. He did not try to pick her up or lead her. He just stayed near her, occasionally saying something quiet and unimportant, letting her get used to the sound of his voice. Eventually she stood up, tucked both pieces of the broken bird under one arm like she would not leave without them, and walked toward the door on her own. She stayed close to the wall and kept her eyes on everything, but she walked. Dale followed her at a distance, and when she paused at the airlock connecting the two ships, he moved to the side again so she could see the path was clear. She crossed over on her own. Greg had already quietly moved his spare clothes out of the storage bunk nearest the galley and put down one of the thicker cargo blankets. The dragon child walked past it twice, inspecting it, then settled on top of it with her back to the wall so she could see the door. She kept the broken toy with her. Greg started calling her Kit almost immediately, before anyone had agreed on anything. Nobody corrected him. The name just stayed. The next 3 days were a combination of careful research and careful feeding. Lena discovered that the wing membranes had small lacerations, probably from the dragon panicking alone in the dark and hitting the walls. She cleaned them slowly and gently over the course of 2 evenings, and Kit tolerated this with a tense, watchful patience that slowly became something a little more like trust. Roy worked through their food supplies with methodical patience until he found that Kit would eat warm protein rations if they were mixed with something sweet. She had a strong preference for anything with cinnamon. Nobody could explain it. Dale spent most of his time on the comm, working through every contact and database he had access to. He wanted to know what species she was, where she had come from, and whether there was anyone looking for her. The species question was hard. Records on dragon species were patchy at best in the outer territories, and the slate blue coloring with amber eyes did not match anything clearly in the colonial database. The origin question was harder. The derelict ship had been registered under 3 different names in 5 years, which was the kind of record-keeping that told a clear story about who had been using it and for what. The third question was the worst. There was no missing persons report for a dragon child matching her description. No family posting. No colony authority looking for her. Nobody was searching. On the fourth day, the message came through from a colonial enforcement vessel called the Warden's Hand. Its commander was a colonel named Vic Hargrove, and he had a tight, precise way of writing official messages that made every sentence feel like a door closing. He informed Dale that the derelict vessel had been flagged in connection with an active investigation into trafficking of exotic sentient species across the outer territories. The dragon child was considered evidence material. He requested her immediate transfer to a federal holding facility pending the outcome of the investigation. He used the word requested, but the tone of the message was not a request. Dale read it once. Then he read it again. Then he took it to Lena and read it out loud to her. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, in a very careful voice, what a federal holding facility looked like for a young dragon who was already afraid of enclosed spaces and had only just started sleeping through the night without waking up making frightened sounds. Dale nodded slowly. He went back to the comm. He wrote a reply to Colonel Hargrove. It was 3 sentences long. It was professionally worded. It said no, that he sent it before Greg could read it and point out all the ways that saying no to a colonial enforcement colonel was going to cause problems. Dale already knew it was going to cause problems. He had decided he did not care about that yet. Kit was asleep on her blanket when he sent it, the broken bird tucked under one claw, her sides rising and falling slow and steady. He looked at her for a moment before he turned off the comm screen. Colonel Vic Hargrove was not used to being told no. That much became clear in the first 2 days after Dale sent his reply. The follow-up messages from the Warden's Hand came in quickly and with increasing firmness. Hargrove cited colonial law, federal jurisdiction, and the importance of the ongoing investigation. He pointed out that Dale was a private citizen with no legal standing to refuse a federal request. He used the phrase lawful custody 3 times in one message. Dale replied to each one. His replies were short, calm, and continued to say no. Greg, who had been reading these exchanges with an expression of growing alarm, finally sat down with his tablet and started digging through colonial law with the focused energy of a man who had suddenly found a project he cared about. He was at it for most of a day. He drank 4 cups of strong coffee and at one point made a noise that sounded like he had found something interesting and then did not explain what it was for another 3 hours. What he found, eventually, was a salvage clause. It was old, written into colonial maritime law about 60 years ago when the outer territories were still being settled, and it had never been updated or removed. It applied to sentient beings found in a state of abandonment aboard derelict vessels under specific conditions. Greg had to stretch the interpretation somewhat to make it fit, but it was there. It was real. And it created, at minimum, a genuine legal question about whether Hargrove had the jurisdiction he claimed. Lena drafted the paperwork. She was meticulous about it, which was a quality she brought to everything she did. She cited every relevant clause, attached the medical records she had been keeping since the day they found Kit, documented the condition of the derelict ship, and wrote a clean summary of the circumstances of discovery that read like something a lawyer had written rather than a ship engineer. Roy produced a notary stamp from somewhere in his belongings. Nobody asked him why he had a notary stamp. He notarized the paperwork without comment. This was, Dale reflected, completely typical of Roy. They filed the paperwork through the colonial civil court system, which put the question out of Hargrove's hands and into a slower, more complicated process. Hargrove sent one more message that was sharper than the others. Dale read it, noted that it was sharper, and did not reply to it. During all of this, Kit watched everything. She had moved from the storage bunk to a spot near the galley table where she could see most of the main deck. She still kept her back to the wall. She still had the broken bird with her always. But she was no longer flinching at sudden noises. She watched Dale at the comm with those wide amber eyes, tracking his expressions, reading the room the way a creature does when it is trying to understand the nature of the place it has found itself in. On the 8th day she climbed up onto the bench beside Dale while he was working and sat next to him. She did not do anything. She just sat there, close enough that her shoulder was almost touching his arm, and watched the screen with him. He did not make a fuss about it. He kept working. After a while she put her chin on his shoulder and went to sleep. Greg walked past, saw this, and made a face that was almost painfully fond. He went away without saying anything. On the 14th day a different name appeared in Dale's message queue. Not Hargrove. A civilian oversight officer named Nora Blake, from the Colonial Affairs Department. She had a straightforward writing style and no wasted words. She said she had been investigating the same trafficking network that the derelict ship was connected to, and that she had been doing so for 3 years. She had reviewed Greg's legal filing. She had reviewed Lena's documentation. She had reviewed Dale's original salvage claim and Roy's notarized paperwork. She said the provisional guardianship was approved pending a formal hearing in 60 days. Greg cheered when Dale read it out loud. It was a sudden, loud sound in the small galley. Kit startled hard, wings snapping half open, head coming up fast, then she looked at Greg. She watched him for a moment, reading his expression, reading the energy in the room. She looked at Dale. She looked at Lena, who was smiling. She looked back at Greg, and then she made a sound. It was small and a little rusty, like something that had not been used in a long time and was not sure it still worked. It was uncertain. It was quiet. Dale had spent enough time listening to her by now that he recognized it immediately. He looked at her and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 2 weeks. It was a laugh. The hearing was held at the Colonial Affairs Station on Kepler 9's primary outpost, a busy, loud place full of people moving fast in narrow corridors. Kit stayed close to Dale the entire time they were inside. Not frightened, exactly, but aware. She kept her eyes moving, cataloging everything, and when the corridors got crowded she pressed close to his side. He let her. People stared, because people always stared, but he had stopped noticing that somewhere around day 10. Nora Blake turned out to be a short, practical woman in her 40s with reading glasses she kept forgetting on top of her head. She ran the hearing with the same straightforward efficiency she had shown in her messages. She had done her research. The questions she asked were specific and detailed, and she had clearly read every page of Lena's documentation at least twice. Lena answered the medical questions. Greg handled the legal ones, speaking fast and precisely in the way he did when he was confident. Roy answered 3 questions about his field medical experience in a flat, factual tone that somehow managed to convey that he knew what he was doing without making it sound like he was trying to impress anyone. Then Nora Blake asked Dale a question that was not about paperwork. She asked him directly, and without any particular warmth or coldness, why he had not simply handed the dragon over to federal custody when Hargrove first requested it, given that refusing had cost him 2 weeks of legal complications and no small amount of personal risk to his salvage license. It was a fair question. Dale had thought about the answer to it, in a vague way, over the past 2 weeks, but he had not put it into words before. He thought about it now for a moment, then he said that when he walked into that cargo bay and saw a kid sitting alone in the dark with a broken toy, crying, he did not think about regulations. He thought about what kind of person walks away from that. He thought about whether he was that kind of person. He decided he was not. He said he did not think most people were. When it actually came down to it, when the thing in front of them was small and scared and had nobody else. Nora Blake wrote something down. She did not comment on his answer. The hearing ran for another 4 hours after that. There were documents to review and questions about the ongoing investigation and a long procedural section about the responsibilities of provisional guardians under colonial law. Greg took notes. Lena asked 2 clarifying questions that were better than anything Dale would have thought to ask. Roy ate a granola bar quietly in the back row. Kit sat beside Dale through all of it. She had brought the broken bird with her, as she always did, held against her chest. At the end of the 4 hours, Nora Blake set down her pen and said that full guardianship was granted to Dale Mercer and the crew of the Iron Horse. She noted the mandatory check-in protocol, every 6 months, without exception. She added a recommendation that they pursue formal diplomatic contact with Kit species when and if that species could be located. She said this last part in a tone that suggested she thought it was important enough to say out loud even in an official record. They left the hearing room into the loud corridor. Greg was already talking quickly, running through what the ruling meant practically speaking, what the check-ins would involve, whether they needed to register with any other authorities. Dale let him talk. He was looking at Kit, who was looking around the corridor with an expression that was different from the one she had worn when they came in. Less watchful. Something a little lighter. Lena touched Dale's arm. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took something out. She had not told anyone she had been working on it, but Dale recognized it immediately. The broken silver bird. Both halves of it, back together. Every tiny gear and feather soldered back into place with careful, precise work, the kind only Lena did. She held it out to Kit. Kit took it in both claws and stared at it for a long time. Then she touched the small switch on the back of it, the one that made it work, and the little bird came alive. Its wings flapped. Its head turned. It opened its beak and sang 3 notes, thin and clear and mechanical. Kit held it and looked at it for a very long time. Then she looked up at Dale. Then at Lena. Then at Greg, who had stopped talking, and at Roy, who had come to stand with the rest of them in that loud corridor full of strangers. She made a sound that needed no translation. It was not the small rusty laugh from the galley. It was something fuller than that. Something that had more room in it. The Iron Horse left the station that evening with one more crew member than it had arrived with. The fuel readout still made Dale feel a little sick. The navigation screen still flickered when Greg walked past it too fast. Lena was already in the engine room, arguing cheerfully with a coolant valve that had been giving her trouble for a month. Kit was on the co-pilot seat with the silver bird in her claws, watching the stars go by through the front window. Dale sat down next to her and started the jump calculations. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about the money.